Hi, Todd Orchide here with GTL Real Estate. In today's video, I want to talk about something that's come up over the last few days since we sent out a video last week to all of our tenants, letting them know about a list of charities we were providing in the local counties where we do business. We had made a bunch of phone calls around to charities around our area, asking which ones would be willing to help tenants with rent assistance if they were having difficulty paying the rent because of the financial crisis. So we maintain this list during normal times also, in case anyone is having difficulty, but it was especially important, of course, with the current financial crisis. We wanted people to have this list, so if they were having difficulty, they would have someone to go to help them pay the rent. This was not well received by some tenants. They were offended and they felt that instead of sending out a list of charities, we should instead be just letting them know that it was okay if they skipped a rent payment or if they were delayed a couple months in paying the rent. So I wanted to send out a video letting people know why we weren't able to do that, number one, and more importantly, why the average landlord across America isn't able to do that, because this is not just something that our tenants have been bringing up. It's been something that's been widespread. You know, there's been calls for eviction moratoriums and rent moratoriums across the country as this crisis unfolds. So I wanted to kind of get some information out there so people could see why landlords just generally aren't able to do that. So first of all, why isn't GTL able to do that? Well, it's important to understand GTL does not own the properties that we manage, any of them. In fact, there's no property that's actually owned by GTL. We manage property on behalf of individual landlords. We are a real estate brokerage, so those individual homeowners hire us to manage their rental property and to collect the rent and do everything that goes along with owning a rental property. They have us take care of that for them. So, you know, we manage about 400 houses for about 300 different landlords. And again, we don't own any of those houses. So we aren't able to make that call that says, you know, we understand the financial crisis, we understand the pandemic, so we're going to waive the rent. That's just not an authority that we have because we don't own the houses, so it's not our decision to make. Now, some tenants understood this and sent us an email and said, you know, I'm not asking you to do it, I'm asking you to ask the landlord, you know, is it okay if we don't pay the rent? You know, and some people said, well, we should have asked every landlord and we should have gotten them all to agree to just waive the rent. And here's the reason that those landlords really aren't able to do that. So I'm going to put some data up on the screen here for you to take a look at. This comes from a survey of 4,000, almost 4,000 landlords across the country. And this is getting their average total income for their household along with how many rental properties they own. So there's a big misconception out there that there are a whole lot of landlords out there, that most rental properties are owned by wealthy people who own a whole lot of houses, and if the rent was interrupted from a few tenants here and there, it wouldn't be a problem for them. They could just make up the income from the other houses or from all the money that they have set aside. That's the general perception that's out there, and that's kind of the feedback we've gotten from the people who were angry over the last few days at our message. They thought that if someone didn't pay the rent, that landlord should be okay with that, because they've got a bunch of other houses and a whole lot of money, so it shouldn't matter to them for a couple of months if the rent wasn't paid during a pandemic. Well, as you can see here, that's not really the reality of who landlords are. Most landlords are small time. 50% of them, as you can see there, own only one rental house. 75% of them own 3 or less. And then there's 25% own more than that. Of that number, most of them own, several more than that, but they don't own huge numbers. So, the perception of, these giant landlords that own thousands of houses, that is almost non-existent. Now, there are a few of those across the country. We call them REITs, real estate investment trusts, or private equity companies. There are a few of those who own a few thousand houses, but they basically represent, 1 or 2% of the total number of rental houses in the United States. All of the other houses are owned by individual landlords and small-time investors. So, those, and by the way, none of our clients are those big landowners. We don't have any institutional clients. All of our clients are small-time investors or accidental landlords, as we'll talk about here in a moment. that we don't represent anybody who's, a big time landlord with lots of houses. And you can see that by the numbers I mentioned earlier, 400 houses owned by 300 owners. So, it's clear that nobody really owns a lot of houses among that group. So, there are, like I said, those companies out there that own a few thousand houses. They're just very few and far between. So, the average landlord owns a house, maybe two. They have the same income as the median household. They make about $65,000. So you say, well, why does the chart there say that the average landlord has $97,000 in income? Well, the reason for that is because of the rent income. So that's being included in that number. So the problem with that, of course, is along with that rent income, they also have the expenses for that rental property. So yes, they have the additional $30,000 in income, but they also have the additional $30,000 in expenses. And those expenses, of course, are the mortgage, repairs to the property, taxes, insurance, lawn care, turnover costs when there's vacancies. There's a whole lot of costs that go into it. So that additional $30,000 that landlord has over the median household income, it's all eaten up by those expenses. So those expenses continue whether the tenant is paying the rent or not. So you're basically taking someone who has the same income as anybody else in America, adding on all those additional expenses from owning an additional house, and then if they don't have that rent coming in, they're still having to pay for all those expenses. The bank, at least right now, isn't allowing people to not pay their mortgage payments. Now, there are calls from certain people in the government and from special interest groups across the country for there to be a moratorium on foreclosures, but that has not happened yet. So, and by the way, I'm not so sure that it's going to happen. So in the current situation where we stand right now, all of those landlords are still required to pay their mortgage. They're still required to pay their taxes, their insurance. They still have to get repairs done on the house. All of these expenses still exist. So if the rent income doesn't come in, they aren't able to pay those expenses because, again, they're just like you. The average landlord, they are working a middle-class job. They make the median household income of $65,000, and they simply aren't able to weather that expense if that rent income isn't coming in. So they're in that situation the same as the tenant is. So, if the tenant doesn't pay the rent, they get late fees, they have collections actions against them. If the landlord doesn't pay his mortgage, he gets late fees. He gets collections actions. He can actually get the house foreclosed on against him, which means that the bank takes the house back from the landlord. Now, what happens when that takes place? Banks don't rent to tenants. So if the landlord doesn't pay the mortgage and the landlord loses the house to foreclosure, the bank kicks out the tenant and auctions the house off to the highest bidder. So in that situation, the landlord loses their house, the tenant loses their home that they're living in. The only person who wins, honestly, are the lawyers who are involved in the transaction, because even the bank loses out on that. They lose money on the house. So it's a bad situation all around when that takes place. And so that's the reason that the landlords aren't able to say it's okay if you don't pay the rent for a couple of months, because if that rent income doesn't come in, they are in a horrible situation where they could lose the house. So, there are landlords out there, don't get me wrong, there are a few people out there who own rental properties who are very wealthy, who could very easily, let tenants go for a couple of months without paying the rent. They do exist, but they are incredibly rare. It's almost unheard of. I believe in all the time we've done business, we've been in business about 11 or 12 years, we might have had one client like that who owned, a number of houses, who had that kind of money where they could weather that sort of storm and be okay with that. It is super uncommon. So the perception that is out there that this is, just the average common landlord that you're renting from is able to just say it's okay if the rent isn't paid, it just isn't the case, unfortunately. So, that's the reason we weren't able to send out a message that said it's okay if the rent isn't paid. Number one, because we don't have that authority. And number two, the landlord can't tell us that because they can't afford it. So, that's the situation we're in. I wanted to get that information out there for everybody. If you still have any questions about any of that, though, please let me know. Just reply to this message. We'll be happy to answer those questions. We hope everybody stays home as much as you possibly can during the current coronavirus pandemic. Try to stay home as much as you possibly can. Try to stay safe and healthy. And if you have any questions, again, just let us know.